What's up, everybody? Jaron Fritz, aka Frizz Visuals. I'm the creative director for Colorado State Athletics with multiple years of professional sports design and photography experience. And today, we're diving into a quick look at my post-processing workflow when shooting a basketball game. We're going to cover how I do it, why I do it, when I do it, and what I do it with. Since this is the first installment of what is likely to evolve into a multi-part series, we're going to start with the bare bones, which is how I approach editing a batch of photos. So you can apply this principle to your own setup. I first start by throwing those hefty raw files into my computer. I edit with Lightroom Classic, and if you don't, I strongly suggest you start. Once your files slowly populate within Lightroom, I go through and check out the ones I am particularly excited about. I do this for a couple reasons. Since I work directly for the team, it's important to have a few photos edited and ready for social media posts either the night of the game or the next morning. On top of that, I'm also the primary graphic designer for Men's Hoops, so after every home win, we typically create 1 or 2 graphics to post right away with the photos used from that contest. As I scroll through, you might be wondering how I go about arbitrating between the photos to determine which ones stand out, and that part is honestly up to you. Whatever moments you feel do a good job at telling the story of the game are usually the ones that I start with. For example, this one caught my eye. It's a shot of Bowen from warm-ups. I like the colors, the framing, and his deadpan stare as he prepares for the battle ahead. The first thing you want to do is get the framing and composition right. I crop all my photos to 4x5, so I activate that sizing to start. I then play around trying to keep the subject at the center in the frame while also giving enough room on the sides so it doesn't seem too punched in. This is one of the most important aspects of editing your photos. There are many times when I feel a photo is completely edited only to revisit it later and have to adjust the composition. And since Moby Arena is depressingly dark, I shoot all my photos slightly underexposed. I would honestly rather increase exposure in post than increase ISO in camera. So when shooting with the White Mamba, there's a couple things I do that are pretty standard. I start by bumping my exposure while increasing clarity and texture. Doing this will exaggerate the highlights and shadows. I want a more even image, so I counteract that by lightening the shadows and decreasing the highlights. Once I feel I have a reasonably exposed image to start with, I get into my mask bag. For this particular image, I want to mimic a light source coming from the top left. So with a huge size brush and feather, I add a little exposure. I always adjust the eyes of every player, so I whiten the whites and deepen the blues, or whatever eye color they happen to have. This is one to be careful with. You don't want to exaggerate this too much. I found the less the better when it comes to this. I often make slight adjustments to their hair as well, enhancing the texture and clarity. This tends to highlight the layers and create a subtle distinction between the subject and the background. I liked where this was going, but I knew it could be better through a couple more masks. I wanted to bring out the orange shirts in the background by increasing the highlights and saturation. Then I also wanted to increase the reflectivity on the floor with light adjustments accompanied with some clarity and texture. As we near the finish, I start to review where we've started and where we are now. After comparing the two, I decided to brighten the right side just a little bit. However, to prevent the white in his shoes from becoming too harsh, I applied a mask to decrease those highlights. The final touch for me in every photo is to activate the denoise function built into Lightroom. I use a value of 30 and use this for every single one of my photos. While it uses AI to reduce the noise, don't be put off. It's just adjusting the same noise reduction sliders you could manually control, so there's really no excuse not to utilize this tool. Once the denoise slider is finished, you have a crispy, almost noiseless image. It's at this point I do my final adjustments on the subject's skin. Bowen already has nice skin, but you gotta make your players look beautiful. So I go along his skin with the remove tool to clean up any kind of discolorations I see, whether on him or from my camera. After smoothing everything out, here is the final before and after. It's definitely a lot better, but I'd say it's still pretty realistic look to what you'd see in person, which at the end of the day is my entire goal in editing. That might have been a little bit much if you're just starting out, but the methods I used from that shot of Bowen apply to pretty much every photo that I edit. For example, let's switch things up now and talk about a different situation. Portrait shots with sweat all over their face. How do we make those beads of sweat truly come to life? This shot of Jalen Crocker-Johnson looks promising for this topic. The initial principles will be the same from the first photo. We corrected the composition, adjusted the lighting as well as texture and clarity, and added in a light source mask. Since we're aiming to emphasize the sweat on his forehead, we'll denoise now instead of saving it for later. All this does is clear up the image, allowing us to focus on fine-tuning the sweat beads without getting distracted by the noise. With the noise out of the way, I started off by adjusting the hair, trying to pull some of that texture back up out of it. When Lightroom auto-selects parts of the subject, sometimes you have to go in and refine it, especially when it comes to hair. Before focusing on the sweat, I added in another mask just to offset the light source we started with. It was a little bit too bright for my taste, so I wanted to bring in some of those darker shadows that would be underneath Jalen. Now for the face sweat. Since the camera focused on his nose, some of the sweat is sharp while other areas are slightly out of focus. Rather than masking each part of his face like I initially intended, I opted for a general mask over his whole face to boost clarity, texture, and the highlights. After that last layer mask, our final image was ready to go, so here is the before and the after. We've covered two types of one-off photos, so now let's take a look at how editing a more traditional sequence of action shots looks. We've got a great 8-photo sequence from Neek. Rather than editing each photo separately and trying to match them, we'll edit one photo and apply those settings to the rest of the sequence. As always, we start with the composition. Then there's even more of an emphasis held on the original lighting adjustments of these wider shots, since there won't be a ton of room for intricate masks. To make sure these settings are transferable, I sync them to just one other photo to start. I found that sometimes the edit looks good in one frame, however looks weird on the others. After the settings look good, I went ahead and applied them across the board to all 8 frames. I attached the crop sync as well, knowing I would have to adjust it later, but this keeps everything the same size. I will merely just have to move the framing up and down until we get to the last frames. And since the lighting adjustments are already spot on, only minor tweaks to the composition were necessary. I prefer to avoid using masks and multi-frame action sequences when possible. Sometimes syncing mask settings across frames leads to inconsistencies that are time-consuming to fix. And in cases like this where it's not essential, I opt for a simpler edit to maintain my sanity. Then, hopefully after following steps similar to the ones I provided, you should have a cool action sequence looking like this. One of the final things I want to focus on is something called in-camera editing. Essentially, it's about capturing the best possible image up front to minimize time spent in post-production. To me, any photo that's in focus and clear can be salvaged by a skilled graphic designer, but that really doesn't represent true photography. Take the shot of Kine, for example. If we rush through the edit, you'll see that this image isn't great just because I'm some kind of editing genius. It's good because I've set myself up for potential for a great edit right from the start. Of course, I'm using my photo editing experience to enhance this image when it comes to the composition and lighting, but I'm merely just enhancing the photo that already exists. Getting better at editing is super overlooked, and I hope you guys picked up on some things in this video you can bring to your own workflow. At the end of the day, editing is extremely important. It does take you to that next level as a photographer, but is just the final leg of the race. Like and subscribe if you learned something from this video. Drop a comment what your favorite edit of the day was. Until next time.